Okay, thank you very much. It's yet again an honour and a pleasure to be at VEDZ. I thank you very much for your hospitality and for giving me another platform to speak about a completely different topic. So what I want to do today is discuss the national, the regional and the international prominence of Daesh, to understand the birth and the evolution of the organisation. I think we need to deploy three separate levels of analysis. So to capture Daesh in its complexity, to understand why it was born, why it grew so speedily, and why it managed to attract such a wide, broad range of international followers. We need to think about on the international level. We then need to think about the regional level, and then finally the Iraqi national level. So today I wanted to ask three big questions. First, where did Daesh come from? What drove the rise of this specific radical Islamist group? Now this, I think, is an argument with its roots in a kind of long-range historical process, and what I've labelled using one of my old professors, Fred Halliday's concept of the Greater West Asian Crisis. So that's the international long-range causality behind it. Then secondly, we need to ask the question, why after 2003 and why in Iraq did this group become so large, grow so quickly? And this simply, in doing this, we need to apportion blame to the myriad failures of the US-led invasion of 2003. Quite straightforwardly, so there's no ambiguity, I would argue that if the United States hadn't invaded Iraq in 2003, Daesh would not have been formed in 2006. And then I want to conclude right at the end, in about 3/4 of an hour, speculating what happens over the next months, weeks and months, when Daesh's grip on northwest Iraq, and especially Mosul, is militarily broken. Now, it's the conclusion where my pessimism really starts to dominate, because I can see no state and no international organisation or regional organisation that has taken any initiative whatsoever to sort out the problems that gave rise to Daesh. Against this background, once Daesh has been driven from Mosul, if nothing changes in Iraq, we will quickly see a myriad of smaller Daesh-like groups, like the sons and daughters of Daesh, springing up, equally as violent, equally as radical, and equally as destructive in Iraq and Syria. Now, this is the central point of my argument. Why is this the case? Because although Daesh is very violent, although it's killed thousands of people, it is a violent symptom of underlying political causes. So it's the effect of a series of political mistakes and problems. And it's these mistakes and problems that haven't been sorted out. This means, in a broadly comparable way to what happened in 2007, when the United States rushed more troops into Iraq and reduced Daesh's numbers to the low hundreds, but they didn't solve any of the political problems, partly because they'd caused them in the first place, and Daesh's numbers then massively expanded over 8 years from 2007 onwards, until they then became the threat they had. So let me start with my kind of broad, long-range theoretical overview, focusing on the long historical processes that have given rise to Daesh. And in doing this, let me accept my biases. I want to firstly promote my own department, the International Relations Department at London School of Economics, and one of my great mentors, Professor Fred Halliday, who sadly prematurely died in 2010. Now, Fred was a great scholar of international relations, a great scholar of the Middle East, and he spent a lot of time after the September 2001 attacks on New York and Washington by al-Qaeda, pondering why this had happened. And he came up with this theory of the Greater West Asian Crisis. This is his explanation for al-Qaeda, which I'm taking and bringing also to explain Daesh. Now, the Greater West Asian Crisis had three broad strands to it. First, a new pattern of linkages between hitherto separate conflicts. Afghanistan, Kashmir, Palestine, then Iraq and Syria, all linked together. Secondly, the crisis of the post-colonial state in in Greater West Asia, in the Middle East, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And finally, the emergence, because of these two things, of this militant transnational Islamism. This new pattern of linkages between conflicts is seen as an unintended consequence of the spread of global satellite media and now the omnipresent social media. The transmission on satellite television, but also through social media, of the images of Muslim suffering, be it the conflict in Palestine, the conflict in Kashmir, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, has given rise to a renewed sense, quite rightly you could argue, of grievance, of a sense that Muslims are being persecuted for their faith. This process reached a new height with the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 and has come to a new pinnacle with the collapse of Syria into civil war after 2011 and the accusation that the international community, and especially the United States, has done nothing to help. So if Iraq became the focus for the invasion of Iraq became the focus of a global outrage at George Bush's administration, then the civil war in Syria has given radical jihadism an arena into which to draw a truly global mix of what I could call jihadi tourists, those largely young men, but also young women, drawn from across Europe, across West Asia, South Asia, into Syria to fight jihad. Now, what's different about Iraq and Syria, unlike the conflict in Palestine or Kashmir, and possibly even Afghanistan, is the way that it's been marketed in a very overtly sectarian way. So the discourse around Iraq and the discourse around Syria is it's not all Muslims that are suffering, but it's specifically Sunni Muslims largely suffering now at the hands of minorities in Iraq, Shia politicians in a Shia-dominated state, and in Syria, an Alawite-dominated state. Now, that may be easy to factually problematize, but this use of overt sectarian rhetoric has filtered through to the creation of Daesh. Now, the second problem that Fred Halliday identified in the Greater West Asian Crisis was this notion of the crisis of post-colonial states. So this crisis, I think, is contemporary. It's not historical, so this is an argument about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It's actually an argument about the Republican states who seized power after Nasser seized power in Cairo in 1952, and this post-colonial development models running out of capacity. If you think this was heralded by President Anwar Sadat's Intifada in Egypt in 1973, where basically the state withdrew from the economy because it was economically bankrupt, but in doing so gave up any claim to legitimacy. We could see something similar with the failure of the Afghan Communist Party to launch a revolution from above in the late 1970s, basically not being able to fulfill its promises to transform and make better the everyday lives of its population. Now, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, Pakistan became a magnet for this first generation of global Islamic radicals when Abdullah Azzam arrived to fight the jihad, to call people from across West Asia to fight against the godless Soviet invaders. And as we know now, out of that campaign grew this network of networks, al-Qaeda, led or financed at least by Osama bin Laden, that then spread out from Afghanistan after the Soviets had been driven from the country. Now, this leads to the third strand of the Greater West Asian crisis, this growth in transnational radical Islam. So we have the combination of satellite television and social media linking Muslims together. We then have the crisis of the post-colonial state, the collapse in legitimacy, or the collapse in institutional capacity. And then finally, stepping into that vacuum, we have a transnational group of Islamic radicals seeking to recruit and exploit these dynamics. So as we know, al-Qaeda was born of the transnational nature of the Afghan struggle, 25,000 foreign fighters taking part in the conflict, drawing support from Pakistan, the Arab world, Southeast Asia and Chechnya. Bin Laden exploited this by setting up al-Qaeda in 1988 specifically to recognize and unite these local conflicts and draw them together into this network of networks. Now this leads us to the rise of Daesh in Iraq and then Syria. The three major causalities that Fred Halliday identified at the center of the Greater West Asian crisis in 2001 and 2002, a pattern of linkages between hitherto separate conflicts, the crisis of the state in the region, and the re-emergence of a new transnational radical Islam, all of these three factors were dominant, but then hugely magnified in the conflict in Iraq, and then after 2003, and then the conflict in Syria after 2011. First, the globalized nature of the conflict in Iraq and then Syria. Now, the attacks on 9/11 in New York and Washington was certainly caused a wave of sympathy towards the United States. And the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001 was backed by both the United Nations resolution and indeed the wider coalition of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. However, the next invasion that the United States embarked in, the invasion of Iraq in March 2003, was marked in contrast by a global outreach. Here was a clear breach of international law and a war with clearly quasi or neo-imperial ambitions. The spectacularly botched operation in Iraq, the number of mistakes that the United States made, quickly gave rise to an insurgency within months of the invasion. That revolt, that Iraqi revolt, first against US occupation and then against the new political order imposed upon Iraq, drew in fighters from next door Syria, from across the Middle East, and then from wider West Asia. The conflict was covered in its every brutal detail by the recently empowered and highly competitive Arab news satellite stations, and the effect was to spread the conflict and the radicalization that it brought in its wake across the Middle East and beyond, with even more polemic rhetoric, imagery, sectarianism being driven forward by the increasing popularity of social media after 2003. Now, what started off, I think, unambiguously in Iraq in 2003 as an insurgency against American occupation, by 2005 had mutated into a civil war, increasingly justified by sectarian ideology. If we look at the number of small insurgent groups fighting the Americans in 2003, by 2005 they'd amalgamated into a coalition of radical Sunni Islamist groups led or at least personified by the Jordanian Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Now, Zarqawi is a fascinating figure, a Jordanian who got his military training during the Afghan jihad, but a man who is always separate from al-Qaeda and especially bin Laden. And as he began to dominate the civil war in Iraq, Ayman Zawahiri, now the head of al-Qaeda, but then the number 2 in al-Qaeda, repeatedly criticized Zawahiri and the Islamic State in Iraq, Daesh, for being too brutal and too sectarian. Now, the current leader of Daesh took control of the organization in 2010. This is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And under his command, this group has become incredibly well organized and extremely ambitious. And it was under Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi that it took the decision in 2011 to intervene in the Syrian civil war surrounding Assad's suppression of the popular demonstrations against him. Now, what Daesh did in Syria was launch the equivalent of a hostile takeover of the radical jihad against the Assad regime. It was this that triggered the final split between Daesh and al-Qaeda, with al-Qaeda supporting Daesh's Syrian rival, Jabhat al-Nusra, as its official franchise in Syria. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's commitment to the conflict in both Syria and Iraq is indicated in April 2013 when he renamed his organization the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. In October 2012, Iraqi government sources estimate that Daesh had doubled its numbers of fighters over the previous year, so from October 2011 to October 2012, to nearly 2,500. Daesh, in December 2013, so a year later, was estimated to have 3,000 hardcore fighters and as many as 5,000 followers. So in launching this jihad into Syria, Daesh had increased its power, increased its notoriety and its publicity, but also recruited more fighters. And you could argue, picking up on this greater West Asian crisis, that Daesh's ability to spread across the region is indicated by the crisis of a series of states in Iraq, in Syria, and then, as we saw yesterday, in the aftermath of Gaddafi's removal in Libya. So you have this series of failing states, which Daesh has used that space to recruit, to organize, and to flourish. So this third theme of the greater West Asian crisis, the re-emergence of a new transnational radical Islam, is seen within Daesh. But what Daesh has done is reduce its theology, reduce its Islamist ideology to a series of very narrow and highly sectarian issues. So broadly around 3 or 4 big themes. Firstly, Daesh would argue that anyone opposing it is an apostate, that all Shia Muslims, it would argue, are apostates deserving death, and even other radical Islamist groups, Hamas, Jabhat al-Nusra, anyone else, are also apostates. So it has a very narrow and very exclusive view of it, and it's developed what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi calls the offensive jihad. To quote him, "We go after apostate unbelievers by attacking them in their home territory in order to make God's word most high and until there is no persecution." Now, what makes Daesh so different from al-Qaeda is its overt and aggressive sectarianism. Clearly, the vast majority of Arabs, of Muslims killed, of Iraqis killed by Daesh, are Shia Muslims that Daesh has labelled as apostates and has argued in this conspiratorial way that they're seeking to control the Middle East. But it also has this philosophy of, quote, remaining and expanding, that Daesh believed, until it started losing territory, that the only way it could survive is by continually expanding its borders. So the declaration of its own caliphate in Mosul on the 29th of June 2014 was also a declaration of its global aspirations. When Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared himself to be caliph, what he was arguing was that Daesh not only wanted to move from Iraq into Syria, or into Libya, or into Yemen, but wanted to move globally. And this, of course, was accentuated in 2014 by the start of the US air campaign against it. And if you think about its global ambition, after the air campaign started in September 2014, Daesh's spokesman, Abu Muhammad al-Mandani, called on all its supporters to kill Westerners arbitrarily wherever they may be found, and basically demanded that it expand its violent jihad to wherever its supporters were. Now, I could be accused at this stage of overstating the global capacity of Daesh. And I think even after the spectacular attacks in France and Belgium, I think there may be a sense, especially in the global media, that it's omnipresent. Keep in mind that the vast majority of Daesh's leadership are still Iraqi, that its networks, its senior networks, are still based in Iraq and moved into Syria, that the jihadis who launched the violent attacks in France and Belgium may indeed have been French and Belgian, but they were shipped to Syria and trained in Syria and shipped back. They proved, although they have limited bases of operation in Libya, some support in Jordan and some support in Lebanon, they haven't managed anything like the growth of popularity, the growth of membership that they enjoyed in Iraq. And even in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda franchise, and indeed the rest of the groups fighting against Assad are by far more Syrian, more popular, and have more supporters. So you could argue it's only in Iraq that Daesh have succeeded in seizing and holding large amounts of territory and becoming the main violent opposition to the regime. So let's look at the why. Why is it only Iraq that Daesh is born in, has thrived in, and why hasn't its attempts to export proved as popular? So let's look at Daesh before it seized Mosul in June 2014. Now, the big thing to keep in mind, although the seizure of Mosul appears to have taken the Iraqi and the American government by surprise, it wasn't an aberration in any way, shape, or form. You see the slow rebuilding of the organization, at least from 2010 onwards. So, you can see that by the rising and falling death toll in the Iraqi civil war. So in the aftermath of the US-led invasion of 2003, the number of people killed in Iraq every year steadily rose from 2003 through to 2006. In 2006, the United Nations estimates that 34,500 people were murdered in Iraq. Then, as we mentioned before, in 2007, George W. Bush, the then President of the United States, recognizing that he was facing a profound defeat in Iraq, stepped up his commitment and raised a much larger number of American troops there and actively pushed them into the fight. Now, that meant that in 2007, 2008, and 2009, the figures dropped off, that less people were being killed. But then slowly, as the Americans withdrew, not having sorted out the political problems that we'll get to in a minute, the number of people being killed in Iraq started to rise. And this rose steeply in 2013, 2014, and 2015. And I think this is clear indication that as the American troops started to shrink, as the Iraqi government ignored the population of the northwest of Iraq that Daesh was trying to recruit amongst, then its capacity to kill people, to murder, to seize territory increased. So in July 2012, Daesh announced the start of a new offensive in Iraq called the Breaking Down the Walls campaign. And this was deliberately targeted at pushing its forces back into the areas that had been driven from during the surge in 2007. In October 2012, Iraqi government sources estimated that Daesh had doubled the number of fighters it had managed to recruit in Iraq over the previous 12 months. And by December 2013, another year later, it had doubled its forces again. So from 2012 through to 2014, Daesh was multiplying and recruiting its forces. And as we know, its final campaign to seize Mosul started in December 2013, when it launched a successful ambush against a number of senior Iraqi commanders in western Anbar. So that resulted in Daesh seizing Mosul on the 6th to the 10th of June 2014. And it's interesting, they seized Mosul 2 months after a nationwide election in Iraq. What were Daesh saying? That election sort of fractured vote amongst the Sunni population of Iraq, who turned away from the ballot box because, quite simply, they felt betrayed by their own politicians who'd failed to protect them from the Iraqi government, but also had failed to deliver development, resources, and therefore hope for the future. So in Daesh seizing Mosul, what they were saying to the Sunni population of Iraq is, you have no hope without us. We're the only people who can defend you from the Iraqi state. And Mosul's governor, Athil Najafi, had to flee the city with his bodyguard, escaping death by a matter of minutes. And then we know the story after that. After Mosul was seized, the Iraqi army, nearly 750,000 men under arms, collapsed as Daesh sped towards Baghdad, only being stopped a couple of 100 kilometers from the city limits. Now, what has driven this forward? Why, beyond the greater West Asian crisis, specifically in Iraq, has Daesh managed to flourish? And I think there are 3 arguments about why Iraq specifically has proved to be the birthplace of Daesh. And all of these 3 causes spring directly from the mistakes that the United States made after 2003. And the first one is the ideological basis of the political order in Iraq after 2003. Now, I don't know if you can cast your minds back to 2003, but the United States occupation, in partnership with the United Nations, set up something called the Iraqi Governing Council. And they set that up under the Mahasasa system, the apportionment system. So I remember Paul Bremer, the American governor of Iraq, saying the Iraqi Governing Council is the most representative governing body Iraq has had in its history. And I thought, what does he mean? How can this be representative? He chose it. He picked all the governing council. Why does he think this is representative? And he said, no, you don't understand. It's representative because it's got a majority Shia members, it's got a minority Kurdish number of members, and it's got a minority Sunni members. So he was calling the Iraqi Governing Council representative because in his mind it represented Iraq along sectarian lines. So what the United States did, along with the returning political exiles that they brought back, was divide Iraq's polity, divide its community along sectarian lines. That, barring Lebanon in the National Pact, is the first, in the 1940s, is the first time, I would argue, any state in the Middle East has had its political system built on sectarian lines. And I think we can see the destructive effects that has had, this overt institutionalization of sectarian ideology at the heart of the state. And every election, national election in Iraq since, in 2005, in 2006, in 2010, and in 2014, has been fought along sectarian lines, with every government afterwards, every cabinet being formed through the Muhassasa system. As we know, the president of Iraq has to be a Kurd. The prime minister of Iraq has to be a Shia, and the speaker of the Iraqi parliament has to be a Sunni. But not only that, after each election, the political parties get together and then divide up the government ministries amongst these sectarian political parties. And that has given rise to profound corruption. That basically the prime minister doesn't have the ability to control these ministries. It's the parties that are given them at the end of the electoral process. And then what they do is pack those ministerial payrolls full of their supporters and asset strip the ministry, both for political corruption but also for personal corruption. And the final political weakness that has undermined this system is under Nouri al-Maliki, the Prime Minister of Iraq from 2006 to 2014. The Iraqi population, alienated by the state's corruption, started to move away from the state, started to turn their back on their corrupt politicians, and Maliki set upon sectarian fear-mongering to solidify his voters. He said that all Sunni politicians were actually Baathists, and those that weren't had become radical Islamists, and that he, as the chief defender of the Shias, was all that was standing between the majority of the population and radical redistribution. He not only recognized this Muhassasa division of the Iraqi society into sectarian identities, but actively exacerbated the hostility and fear amongst the communities. Now, the second reason that Daesh managed to flourish beyond the sectarianization of Iraqi politics is its infrastructural weakness. Now, keep in mind that Iraq was under the harshest sanctions ever imposed on a country in international history. That after Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990 and was driven out in 1991, the United Nations, with near unanimity, imposed these sanctions on Iraq with the sole aim of trying to trigger the collapse of the Iraqi state under Saddam Hussein. Now, the great unintended irony of that was they worked. The sanctions caused the collapse of the Iraqi state, but in 2003, just as the Americans invaded and took control of the state that they'd done so much to collapse. As we remember, there was widespread looting with, I think, 17 of the 20 Iraqi government ministries being taken to pieces and wrecked. But beyond that, as I've just mentioned, the Muhassasa system, this dividing up of ministries along sectarian lines, allowed the ministers to be profoundly corrupt because they were never held to account. Just after the 2005 elections, there was a mini property boom around Sloane Square Station in London, in West London, in Chelsea, because a key number of Iraqi ministers had stolen so much from their new ministries that they could buy big houses along King's Road. That's the level of profound corruption that clearly weakened the state. Billions of dollars were pumped into Iraq under the American occupation and then afterwards to try and regenerate the electricity grid, to try and deliver electricity every day. Yeah? Now, if you think of the scorching summers in Iraq, refrigeration and indeed air conditioning becomes central. The average Iraqi, after this billions of dollars have been pumped in, could only expect 7 hours a day of electricity in any one day. And 79% of the population surveyed in 2014 said their electricity supply was getting worse. So this corruption has direct effects on ordinary Iraqis. They can't expect clean running water, electricity from the government that until the drop in the price of oil had billions of dollars flowing into its coffers. And then finally, the final reason why Daesh could seize so much territory in 2014 was the collapse of the army in the face of its retreat. Why? Why was the army so weak? Well, we know for reasons of their own that the United States infamously decided in 2003, in May 2003, to disband the Iraqi Army, to send home hundreds of thousands of armed and trained Iraqis, and initially at least to refuse to pay their pensions. Now, unsurprisingly, they realized the error of their ways in 2004 and then quickly set about trying to rebuild the army that they disbanded. However, the Iraqi army, much the same as the overall Iraqi state, was profoundly corrupt. For example, if you decided you were an Iraqi and you wanted to join the army and go to officer training college, you'd have to pay a bribe of $3,000. If you wanted to be promoted to a general, and if you want to become an Iraqi general and you've got a bit of spare money, all you need to do is pay $30,000. Now, why would an Iraqi invest so much money in becoming a general? Because he would know that if he was corrupt, he could then take the payroll, the money that Baghdad would send to him to pay for his soldiers' wages, their food, and the petrol to move their vehicles around, and put it in his own bank account. The Ministry of Defense estimates that 25% of the Iraqi army before 2014 didn't exist. That it was simply ghost payrolls used by commanders to inflate their wage bills so they could take the money home. And when you look at the Iraqi garrison in Mosul, you saw soldiers in the markets of the city buying food because their generals had stolen the money for them to be given food from the army. So you imagine, you're a soldier in Mosul and you see Daesh forces, highly motivated, incredibly violent, coming towards you. And you look behind, and where are your generals? They've already left, they've fled. The senior Iraqi generals fled up to the Kurdish regional government. Why would you fight? Why would you fight to defend an army and indeed a state that was so profoundly corrupt? So they didn't. They threw off their army uniforms, changed into civilian clothes and went home, which left left Mosul and northwest Iraq completely unprotected, which is why the forces of Daesh managed to move so quickly and so closely to Baghdad. So I think in the final section of the talk, I think it's fairly safe to bet that Iraqi special forces will be at the center of Mosul within the next few months. It might take longer than journalists are predicting, but they will have driven Daesh's forces with great human suffering and bloodshed out of Iraq's second largest city. Should we then cheer and celebrate the end of Daesh in Iraq? Sadly not, I think, for a series of profoundly depressing reasons. Firstly, you could argue that since 2014, sectarian politics in Iraq, if anything, has got worse. I was last in Baghdad in March this year, and I tried to find politicians who were legitimate and had the capacity to represent Mosul, to represent the population of the northwest of Iraq, and I couldn't find any. The most senior Sunni politician in Iraq is the Speaker of the House of Parliament, the Speaker of Parliament, Jabouri. He can't go back to his own constituency without an army guard because his own constituents don't see him as legitimate. So Iraqi politics simply haven't changed that much. Secondly, on the 13th of June 2014, as Daesh forces started moving towards Baghdad and the army collapsed, Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani issued a fatwa saying that all able-bodied people all able-bodied men should defend their country and their people and their holy places. Now, Sistani is quite an astute man. In issuing this fatwa, he said they had to go and fight for the government, and the government set up 2 days later what they called the Hashd-e-Shābi, the Popular Mobilization Forces. But what actually happened is the 60 to 100,000 people who volunteered to defend Baghdad didn't flow into the government army. They flowed in to a host of militias, the Badr Army, Jaysh al-Badr, Asib al-Haq, Jaysh al-Mahdi, Katib, Hezbollah. These sectarian, violent militias who previously had fought the civil war from 2004-05 onwards. So what we've seen is the massive expansion of overtly sectarian violent militias in the aftermath of the fall of Mosul. These militias aren't going to go away. They've been armed and they now are paid for by the Iraqi state. And once Mosul falls, what are they going to do? I suspect they're going to head back towards Baghdad and back towards Basra and seek to dominate politics in Iraq, which is the recipe, I'm sad to say, for another civil war. So I think finally why Daesh won't go away is because the Iraqi state remains profoundly corrupt. It remains profoundly weak, and it remains profoundly sectarian. So all the issues that created the space and gave rise for Daesh, both in 2006, then again after 2011, are still present here today. So let me conclude by saying I think Iraq is an extreme case, and an extreme case of sectarianism and state failure that we can directly blame the Americans for. That the Muhassasa system, the corruption and the state weakness come directly from policy mistakes made by George W. Bush and his cabinet. However, more worryingly, I think, that if we pull the lens out, if we look at the wider Middle East after 2011, we see a similar set of more long-range problems, the weakness of the post-colonial state, the linking of these different conflicts from Palestine through Kashmir, the sense of anger, but now we can add to that after 2003 what could be described as a new Middle Eastern Cold War, with states, both Iran but also the Arab Gulf states, or at least some of them, using sectarian ideology as a plank of their own foreign policy. And finally, we have social media, which drives this divisive rhetoric. So I am in no way optimistic that after Daesh has been militarily beaten, that they will not re-emerge. I suspect all the problems that drove their rise and their seizure of Mosul are still there, and so I suspect we'll see the son or daughter of Daesh taking a new role in Iraq, not going away in Syria, and this radical, violent ideology finding adherents in other places in the Middle East. Thank you very much.